We've just looked at how to read the UBS and the Nestle-Aland apparatus. In the apparatus, external evidence is presented for particular readings. Here now we'll talk about that external evidence in more detail. We've talked about sorting out the different readings in the manuscripts by being able to read the apparatus in the UBS and the Nestle-Aland Greek critical editions. So here our focus is on evaluating this external evidence. And the first point to note is that we need to be able to put a date on the evidence as best we can. You can use the table in the appendix of your Greek New Testament to find out the dates of the manuscripts that are listed. There are pages of tables that will say that a particular manuscript is probably dated from this century or maybe these 2 centuries. Here we have P52, which is the oldest known fragment of the New Testament from the early 2nd century. However, there have been some more recent discoveries of papyri, and it's not impossible that we actually already hold an earlier papyrus piece or a fragment than P52. This is an ongoing piece of research, and so the numbers keep increasing in terms of what our evidence is. Now the next slide gives some of this information that comes from a card that comes with the Nestle-Aland Greek Critical Edition. And so in addition, we have a card as well as the appendix from the Greek New Testament. Here's the card that comes with the Nestle-Aland Critical Edition of the Greek New Testament. This information is found again in the text itself at the back of your Greek New Testament. Look at the first page on the left here. You can see that there are 9 columns in all. There are 2 vertical lines that divide those 9 columns into 3 columns, 3 columns, 3 columns. All the evidence on that left side of the page with those 9 columns is evidence that relates to papyri. So you see papyrus 1, for example, papyrus 2, going down the first column. Right next to that column, the second column tells you what is in that papyrus in a very general way. And you find a definition of these abbreviations right at the bottom of this first page. A, for example, stands for, and it's in German, but the Book of Acts and the Catholic Letters. That's Hebrews and following, except for the Book of Revelation. And then if they, instead of giving you an A, if they just give you ACT, that's only the Book of Acts. Or if they just give you a CATH, that's just these Catholic letters, except for the Book of Revelation. And E doesn't stand for the epistles, it stands for Evangelion, or the Gospels. Now that doesn't mean it contains all the Gospels, it might even only contain half of a verse from one of the Gospels. But at least you know it's not going to be any papyrus that has any piece of Paul's letters, for example. And that's our next example. A P stands for the Pauline letters, and an R for the Book of Revelation. The third column tells you what century they think this papyrus comes from or is dated to. So P1 is from the 3rd century, Roman numeral 3. And that's how to read that information from Nestle-Aland. You do need to be able to establish the date of manuscripts because obviously the earlier, the better. The closer we are to the original writing, the better in our evidence. Here's just a closer look at some of that information we just went over. Now here's P13 with a portion of Hebrews. Papyri provide us the oldest evidence. We have 92 papyri and counting, showing portions of the New Testament dating from the 2nd to the 8th centuries. Here we have some examples of uncials or majuscules. Notice all the capital letters. On the left we have Codex Sinaiticus, an important manuscript discovered, we say, by Tischendorf at St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, and then Codex Alexandrinus on the right. We have 276 uncials dating from the 2nd to the 10th centuries. I have a website there. You might want to look at more of Codex Sinaiticus if this interests you. Here we have some more uncials, Codex Vaticanus, the Matthew 11, 8b through 10a. As you look at that more carefully with this larger print, you can see that there are a few marks on the page, but not punctuation and not separation of words. In fact, as you get to the end of a line, you're not at the end of a word necessarily. You might just continue on to the next line. So that creates the possibility of copying errors, and that's only one reason why we have different manuscripts during the copying stage of the Bible. Here we have an example of a minuscule number 669 from the 10th century. And you might want to have a look at these websites too if you want to explore this further. What I want to point out is the difference in the handwriting. We've moved from uncials to more of a cursive type of script. It was a script that allowed copyists or scribes to copy more quickly. And here is a lectionary, just to continue to give you some pictures of what we've been talking about. So in the lectionary we might have a quote from Scripture, and that becomes evidence for us of what readings were around at the time. You may find that placing information into a chart will be the easiest way to convey some of the information about manuscripts. So rearrange the data that you find in the apparatus to convey information about the date and text type, which we still have to talk about, of the manuscripts. This isn't always obvious or easy, and there may be debate about some of the evidence, but do the best you can. Use different charts for various readings. So here's a chart for reading 1, here's a chart for reading 2, and so forth. I'll have an example in the next slide. So here we have Mark 1:2, and it's the first reading, which reads in Isaiah the prophet, and here's the evidence for it. Now, the rows are referring to text types, which I need to talk about now. Alexandrian, Caesarean, Byzantine, and the Western, and then just another row for unknown. These are the 4 major text types that scholars have talked about. There's a lot to say about the theory of text types. Some of these aren't really even definable text types, but it's just the way scholarship has grouped manuscripts to date. In another slide, we're going to look more carefully at this, but just at this point, think in terms of family similarities. If you take 4 different families and you look at them carefully, you'd see that they have family resemblances. Same color skin, same kinds of features, perhaps their eyes or their height or their build. facial features, and so forth. The same kind of thing is said about manuscripts. So if they tend to represent a certain way of copying, perhaps the Western text type we can say is a bit sloppier type of copying, and the Alexandrian seems to be more precise. The Alexandrian is also called the Egyptian. These texts come from the area of Egypt, typically. There's the Caesarean text type and the Byzantine text type. Byzantine is the Eastern Empire. Manuscripts coming from the East, as opposed to manuscripts coming from the West, which are often Latin manuscripts. Now note that in addition to putting manuscripts in here, along with their dates, I have divided my table into whether we're looking at papyri, uncials, minuscules, lectionaries, translations or versions, and then the Church Fathers. And then with the Church Fathers, you can even search this online, but you can use different texts or whatever resources you want to discover that Origen is actually from the early 3rd century. So you put that evidence in. You can also say, and he was in Egypt as well as Palestine. So Origen himself represents sometimes an Alexandrian type of reading and sometimes a more Caesarean type of reading, Caesarea being in Israel. Codex L is a witness to the Alexandrian text type in the Gospels, but not outside of the Gospels. How are you going to know that? Well, what you have to do is use the text by Metzger and Ehrman, called the Text of the New Testament, and look up whatever they tell you about these different texts. There are lots of pages there that will say something about Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and these other texts. Obviously, they don't have something to say about every single piece of manuscript evidence that we have, but they will say something about the manuscript evidence that is most significant. And so be sure to look that up as part of the process of saying whatever you can about a particular piece of evidence. If you hadn't looked this up, in this case, you might have thought that L belongs to some other text type and not the Alexandrian. If you're looking at it, Gospels, and we are here, we're looking at Mark 1:2. Once you've discovered, as best you can, the date of the evidence, of the manuscripts, the versions, the lectionaries, Church Fathers, then you can move on to talking about geographical distribution of the evidence. The wider the geographical distribution of evidence, the stronger the evidence is. With respect to manuscripts, we can say that sometimes we know the origin of a particular manuscript. Again, you have to check for that information in the text of the New Testament by Metzger and Ehrman. Text types can also tell you something about the region. If we're talking about a Western text type, then we're saying it's in the western part of the empire. If we're saying Byzantine, it's in the eastern part. If we're saying Alexandrian, then we're talking about the area of North Africa around Egypt. When we look at versions, we know geographical distribution because we know where those languages were spoken. Latin was widely spoken, but something like Armenian is to be identified with Armenia, or Coptic with Egypt, or Slavic with Eastern Europe. The Church Fathers can often help us, too, with not only dates, but also places. And information on them can be found in the Catholic Encyclopedia that's online. It's just one place you can find this information. The final step for evaluating the external evidence is to say something about text types. I've introduced this as much as I plan to in this particular set of slides, and so we'll move on to some further part of the lecture and other slides to talk about text types.